think we all can agree that given how under fire the ad industry is and given the number of layoffs that are happening every month now, and that number seems to be increasing. And why is that? Of course, everyone has a hypothesis. And one of the most frequent hypotheses that I get lately is emotion. And if we simply get back to creative and if we simply are able to tap into emotion better, then of course the next advertising renaissance will happen. Well, unfortunately, that's not the case for a number of reasons, which I'll share with you in a minute. But I'm here to bring some good news for a change in the midst of all this doom and gloom. My name is Christopher Demetrakos. I'm a neuroscientist. I'm a 25-year ad veteran. I'm also the CEO and founder of a company called Manzanita. We make a platform called Axe3 that does some really cool stuff. So today we're going to talk about the yardstick. And the yardstick is something that you use to measure with. And we measure ads, for example, by how we feel. And of course, everyone's an expert on advertising because you see an ad and you know how you feel. So you know what a good ad is, and that qualifies everyone. That's a yardstick. But the thing is that people are very, very different. Very different. And so using emotion as a yardstick is where the industry has been failing. And as a neuroscientist, I'm here to explain to you why that is. So you may remember Jenner Pepsi, or Bud Light.
Bud Light can no longer say it's the best-selling beer in the country because it is not. You can see Bud Light sales have gone down since March. Bud Light sales are down like 24% in just the last few weeks. It all started happening. What do you think, March? Well, what happened in March? This, right?
Or most recently, Jaguar. Clearly, the marketing teams and the creatives in those particular instances thought that was a great idea. They were great ideas and they shared them and there was universal support and they put them out, but the emotion on the receiving end was clearly not the same. So how could we avoid this in the first place? Well, first of all, emotion is not a yardstick by any means for ads. Let's take some examples as evidence. So this is a study done by Persado, and they took 250 qualified marketers and they showed them a series of 3 ads and asked them to choose the winner, the highest performer from amongst them. The results were that they chose correctly 33% of the time. And you being on top of your statistical math, understand that 33% in a group of 3 is pure chance. Actually, and not coincidentally, Byron Sharp and the Ehrenberg Bass Institute did a similar study, and the results were identical in their study. Emily Falk from the esteemed University of Pennsylvania conducted a study on approximately 30 heavy smokers, and she put them in an fMRI and showed them 3 versions of an anti-smoking commercial and asked them to rate them in order of effectiveness. So as you can see, right, the fMRI measured their non-conscious midbrains, and when the non-conscious midbrain lights up, obviously that indicates resonance. So you can see that version C was the most popular amongst the non-conscious midbrains inside those fMRIs. And when they ran the commercial, of course, version C outperformed the others by a wide margin. But what did they report from their conscious minds and their conscious perceptions? Version C was actually dead last, as you can see here.
So it might seem weird or counterintuitive that the brain reveals information that people's own beliefs about themselves or their intentions to perform a behavior don't actually reveal. This is actually consistent with a lot of behavioral research that suggested over the past several decades that we don't necessarily have conscious access to the factors that make us change our behavior.
Similarly, Leonard van Brussel did a study on hedge fund managers and found very, very similar results. When those managers were in an fMRI and they were shown a set of stock memos and asked to choose the winners, consciously, they couldn't, but their non-conscious midbrains chose a subset of those stocks that outperformed the markets a year later. So what's going on here? Our non-conscious midbrains know when our conscious brains cannot report this. This brings us back to the question of emotion. If you just see how you feel, then clearly that's going to indicate what's truth. That's very similar to patients going to a doctor's office and asking them to diagnose stomach pain by simply looking at them. Of course, that's preposterous. No one would go to this hospital, right? You need to do a proper diagnosis in order to know the source of that malady. And in similar fashion, we have to do a proper diagnosis of an audience in order to build an effective ad for these groups of people, because we're all different. In the case of emotions, if you read Lisa Feldman Barrett's work, you know that there are no hard circuits for any emotion.
You might believe that your brain is pre-wired with emotion circuits, that you're born with emotion circuits, but you're not. In fact, none of us in this room have emotion circuits in our brain. In fact, no brain on this planet contains emotion circuits.
And if any scientist is claiming that there is a hard circuit, that will most likely be related to motor function. Especially in the case of fear, animals tend to freeze up when they're afraid. That's motor function. That's a motor circuit. It's not emotion. So therefore, given that emotions are assembled from what we'll term interoceptive and exteroceptive stimuli in real time and according to the individual, emotion cannot serve as an appropriate measure for what is quote unquote good. Therefore, if we were to redo the campaigns for Jenner Pepsi, for Bud Light, and for Jaguar, we could actually go back, measure the audience, get a proper read on their cognitive traits, and then we know exactly what we can make and what we should make. So what is a cognitive trait? It could be as simple as introversion versus extroversion, or it could be, for example, openness to new experience. These people often seek, on the high end, they seek novelty, they seek abstraction. On the low end, they prefer what's familiar. You can even see this in animals. This is absolutely universal across Homo sapiens, but again, you can see it in animals. For example, if you have a couple of dogs, you show up at the lake, drop the back of your truck, and the two dogs go dashing toward the lake. One of them dives in head first without any hesitation. The other one skids to a stop and watches the other one diving in. Well, the dog that dove in is high openness. The dog that did not is low openness. So these are examples of cognitive traits. And so we are actually born with these. Of course, they move according to our experience and according to the environment. But when you aim at cognitive traits, you're actually targeting the source of emotion, because everyone will respond differently according to their traits. For example, if I show our esteemed ops director a movie trailer for a horror movie, she'll say, yeah, no thanks, not interested in that. But if I show our head of data science the same trailer, he'll say, yeah, let's go, I'm into that. Same stimulus, two entirely different responses. So let's look at some examples that we've done. So using the introversion versus extroversion example. So we did a project for a global whiskey brand that you've likely heard of, and their brief said, don't target essentially introverts, because their brief was, our target are social people of varying age. And so go after the socials. Consequently, all of the people who were responding to that messaging were extroverts. It's no surprise. When we diagnosed the audience, however, using Acts 3, we figured out that more than half of the audience were introverted. So therefore, we created introverted messaging by way of social execution, and we were able to raise their revenue by 56% in 3 months without a single paid ad. This is what happens when you align with the cognitive traits of the audience, with a proper diagnosis, a proper yardstick, not emotion, the cognitive traits. So when those introverts look at an extroverted ad, it actually doesn't even get into their brain, because it's blocked by the most powerful ad blocker in the world called your reticular activating system. which removes more than 99% of reality every single second. So just creating an ad and throwing it out there does not guarantee people will see it. In fact, the opposite is most often the case. So when you create something that's in line with their cognitive traits, you're getting into the brain and you will trigger dopamine and oxytocin, which is the resonance response and is responsible for creating every customer ever. So in sum, emotion is not your yardstick. As we've seen, groups of people will have certain emotions that are entirely different from other groups of people. Now, in order to measure what will cause the desired emotions, we need to understand their cognitive traits. And we measure that. We can measure that across large swaths of people. So if you see any kind of device or self-reporting that claims to measure the emotions of people, you might want to back away from that because it's most likely not the case and it's giving you false information. The tried and true method is to examine their cognitive traits and engineer resonant messaging from there. Thanks for watching.